You're listening to Dairy Voice by Dairy Business News, a podcast exclusively for the dairy industry.
One of our sponsors of the Dairy Voice podcast is National DHIA. NDHIA ensures information accuracy and represents their members' interests. They are the direct voice for the dairy information industry. To find out more, go to dhia.org.
Welcome to our latest edition of the Evolution of the Great Cow, sponsored by Showbox Sires on Dairy Voice. We continue to try to bring you stories of iconic people in the business and the cows that help make this business. We always have a good time with this, but today I've been looking forward to this for some time because I've got a dear friend and a mentor of mine that we're going to interview and talk about his career. Bob Fitzsimmons from East Montpelier, Vermont is our guest today. And Bob, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you, Tim. It's good to be here.
We'll have a lot of fun reminiscing, Bob, about old times and talking about new times and things that make this whole business as good as it is. But, you know, Bob, we call this series the Evolution of the Great Cow, and sometimes I look at it as the evolution of great people. How similar is it? Great cows and great people, they seem to go together, and that's why I think this podcast series is so fun. But Bob, the way I want to start today is, I know you're known to our listeners, but give them a Reader's Digest version of your career. I thought I could do it, but shoot, Bob, it's too complicated. Tell us where in the world you came from.
A lot of bumps and turns in the road along the way. I graduated from the University of Vermont, like you and Sharon, many, many moons ago. When I came out of school, I was recruited by Bill Weeks of Animal Analysis Associates, and he wanted me to be an analyzer for his company. Probably there's nothing that I would have rather done at that point in time than work with Bill on the AAA program. I absolutely loved the job. I started in working and everything seemed to be going pretty well. The only problem I had was I was a young whippersnapper. I got paid by the number of cows that I analyzed, and I had to kind of sell myself, which I probably wasn't the best at that stage of my life. And long story short, even though I loved the job incredibly, like I couldn't have asked for a better job at the time, I just could not make ends meet doing it. So I went to work for a good friend of mine, Tim Leach. He's probably been one of my best friends throughout my life, and I basically was a farmhand for him. I milked cows, I threw hay, I chopped corn, I did, about anything that a dairy farmer in Vermont would do. And did that for a while, and then heard that the Holstein Association was looking for classifiers. So I thought, well, I'm probably pretty young to do that, but I'll give it a try. So I applied, and they called me up and brought me in for an interview. And apparently at the time, they were experimenting with younger people doing some of the work there at Holstein. Most of the classifiers when I started were retired dairymen that had been in the business for several years or many years and kind of took classification on as a retirement job, or somebody that maybe passed the farm on to their offspring and decided to be classifier.
Hey there, after you've finished enjoying this podcast, might I recommend you join me, Tim Hammerich, and our guests on Clarity at Work from Zoetis. We'll be talking genetics and their place on the dairy. You've got a seat at the table as we discuss innovations, what's next for the industry, and more.
I have to find the value in everything that I do, and I still find value in Clarified Plus, so we're going to continue to use it.
Just search for Clarity at Work wherever you listen to podcasts. Once you finish with this podcast, of course.
So Les Terpstra and I were the two first young guys to ever classify for Holstein. And I think it worked out pretty well. I did that for 5 years. Again, I absolutely loved the job, except for the fact I was in hotels 3 weeks out of the month. My girlfriend, Pat, and I decided I needed to be home more often than that. So I took a job at Dream Street Holsteins in New York and did that for a while, decided that it wasn't for me. Went back to the Holstein and was a classifier again for a couple more years. And then I was offered the director of classification job, which I took, and it kept me home most of the time. I still did quite a bit of traveling, but probably 4 or 5 days out of the week I was home. So that worked out pretty well.
Bob, I'm going to interrupt because you and I made a promise to each other. If either of us got telling lies, we were going to stop the other one. And you said that the Dream Street job didn't fit. The true part of that story is Pat wanted you home until she had you home for a while, and then she was ready to get rid of you again. Isn't that more true?
Pretty close to fact, yeah, Tim. Yeah.
What does life on the cutting edge mean to alfalfa grower Dan Sheps?
Harv Extra has been very consistent on our test results from first crop through fourth crop. The higher quality has allowed us to feed less byproducts and feed more alfalfa haylage in our diet. And cows are able to have a higher intake with a higher quality forage.
Hear more of Dan's story at harvextra.com.
So, Bob, you had a great tenure, a great run at Holstein, and still today, Bob, I'll be with you, and people that you classified their cows, 50 years ago come up to you and talk to you about old Betsy that you scored, or how much fun they had when you're there, or how much they didn't like you. I mean, all those things. But certainly for a young person, I would say you were one of the first you called yourself a whippersnapper to do that job. Why do you think it worked? Why were you successful that young when most everybody was older?
I'm not completely sure, Tim. I absolutely enjoyed looking at cows. I enjoyed visiting with farmers and relating to farmers. I think one of the things that I kind of decided to do when I started doing it was to talk about every cow that I classified and try and find something good about all of them. There were a few that it was pretty hard to imagine something good about them, but I tried anyway. And people seemed to like that approach rather than just saying she's 82, and on to the next cow.
How big a staff did you have of classifiers when you were head of classification? You remember how many guys you had working for you?
Yeah, I think we had 33 classifiers when I was director of classification.
Yeah, and that, Bob, I think a lot of people wouldn't have any idea that would have been the size of the staff back then. I mean, it obviously classification has evolved, but think about that, 33 classifiers under your leadership at that time. That says a lot about how many cows were getting scored.
Well, yeah, we went to the 8-month classification interval at that time, and it had been 15 months before that. So obviously everybody didn't classify every 8 months, but a percentage of people did. So I can remember being in a board of directors meeting, laying this all out for the people on the board of directors, and Bob Beaupre from Boulder Valley Holsteins in Colorado says to me, he says, "Bob, this sounds great. It sounds like everything is positive about it, but," he says, "I know situations like this, everything can't be totally positive. What's the downside?" And I said, "Well, Bob, how many cows do you have in your herd you'd like to get rid of?" He says, "Oh, I don't know. I always have 15 to 20% of them I'd like to get rid of." I said, "Yeah, I do too. And now you're asking me to add 10 instead of getting rid of." And that didn't go over very well with management of Holstein. Like, I got scolded pretty hard after that. But I always thought that the board of directors were a smart bunch of guys. They got elected for a reason. And I always tried to give them the good side, the bad side. This is what's going to happen. What do you think? Rather than trying to stuff things down their throat.
And that's why it worked. And that's why they had so much respect for you, because again, you were a resource for them and they were a resource for you. So it worked. After your Holstein experience, you were high up with Holstein and had a great job. What happened? That's when you kind of moved just down the road from me to East Montpelier. Is that pretty close to right?
Yep. Lloyd Boyd, who was one of my favorite classifiers and favorite people also, had a pretty good relationship with Jerry and Jim Rappaport, who were up here at Lylehaven Farm in East Montpelier. And they were looking for a farm manager / genetic manager. So I met with them. I was impressed with Jerry and Jim, but especially Jerry right away. You could tell he wanted to keep the land open that he had purchased. He wanted to have cows there. He wanted to have really good cows. And they had made some splashes in the Holstein business. They had bought into the mighty fine Matt Misty family. And so I knew they were serious about what they were doing, and they offered me a job, and I decided I'd like to be around cows a little more than I am right now. It's close to home. My wife didn't mind the move to East Montpelier. We were closer to my mom than we were before in Brattleboro, and it seemed to work out really well.
And how many years were you there at Lylehaven, Bob?
I'm going to guess. I think 13, Tim.
Yeah, and we'll circle back to Lylehaven because I want to talk a little more about that. But then after Lylehaven, you took another great run at developing a herd. Do you want to talk a little bit about that piece?
Jerry at Lylehaven got to a point where he said he really didn't want to invest in the big time showing type thing. And I had gotten kind of addicted to that. And I understood, why. He was the one that made the decision. So Tom Morris called me one day and he said, would you consider moving to the Midwest? I said, well, not really. My family is all here. I like living here. I like being in Vermont. And he said, well, could you work out something part-time? I said, yeah, probably. I've traveled my whole life. It's not going to change that much. Go someplace else. So long story short, I met with the Baders at Carousel Farms and ended up moving out there. And I took my right-hand man, Perry Fend, with me.
And you had a great run at Carousel, a couple great champion cows, a lot of great breeding cows. And Bob, one of the greatest sales I've ever been involved with was the finale there at Carousel. Do you remember any of the statistics from that sale?
I think it ended up being like a $6 million sale.
Yeah.
My friend Tom Morris had a nice day that day.
That's why he still talks to you and I think. When he tells me about driving his little tractor around the farm, I say, well, that's because of Fitzy. But no,
the funny thing is, out of that sale, if somebody had just bought the herd of cows, they could have had intermediate champion at Madison. They could have had the first place 4-year-old, and they could have had premier exhibitor. They all went through the ring that day. It was a special bunch of cows.
You had put together a great bunch, and you and Perry and your team had really built success and won Mr. Bader, a World Dairy Expo championship, and also several exhibitor banners and breeder banners at big shows. So,
yep.
Bob, we could go on forever about your history developing cows. Later on in your career, you did some AI work. You were a great partner of mine at St. Jacobs. You still dabble in the semen business a bit today. I'm laughing because you said you're one of your dear friends, Tim Leach, you worked for right out of college there after you did work for Mr. Weeks. And you said one reason we couldn't do this podcast next week is because you're going deer hunting with him. So you and Tim you're still connected and still do a lot together, Bob?
We do. We were best man at each other's wedding, or if you listen to Tim, he was the best man at both our weddings. But yeah, we still do a lot together. We talk on the phone, and I'm real good friends with his son Seth, who's kind of running the show there now. And proud of Seth and proud of Tim too. As far as Tim took over the farm when he was 19 years old. His parents both died the same year. He was at UVM with me, and he had to go home. And you could tell he was scared to death, but he buckled down and made some decisions, and the place is still running well.
Woodlawn Farm, I'd say, is one of the premier breeder herds in the Northeast anymore, Bob, and certainly your tutelage and mentorship with Tim has meant a lot. But great friendship. I could go into stories about the two of you together, but again, our listeners we'd have to edit that out. So. Glad we got Leach talked about in this podcast. Bob, I want to circle back. Many of our listeners would know the name Jerry Rappaport, but I would say no one in our industry knows Jerry as well as you knew him. Tell people who Jerry Rappaport is and a little about the man.
I think somebody described him as the 11th member of the Boston City Council, like he had that much influence in downtown Boston. One point in time, he owned 42 acres in downtown Boston. So that'll give you a little bit of an idea of what his net worth might be. Was a developer, an attorney. It was almost like he did whatever he wanted to do and did it extremely well. His Harvard professor owned a home in East Montpelier, and there was a farm next to it that was kind of failing. And they were going to sell the farm to a real estate developer who was going to put condominiums in there. And the guy Mr. Banfield or Dr. Banfield just couldn't bear to see that happen. Talked to Jerry. Jerry came up and bought the farm. He didn't need a farm, but for his friend, he did it and for an investment. And then he ended up buying a couple other farms too. And there were some really good breeders in the area: Ed Gould, Gary Darling, Bryce Metcalf, Hugh Langmaid. He got involved with all these guys and got the good cow bug. Like he, started showing at the state shows, a little bit at Eastern States, and wanted to go bigger than that. And that's when he asked me to help him do that. But he was a great guy. He loved the business. This is what he did for fun. And he was committed to the business. I remember we got in a little trouble with DHI at one point in time. We had a lot of calves on milk. Our milk weights weren't adding up to the bulk tank weight. And I tried to explain it to them, and with common arithmetic, it didn't stick. They did 4 or 5 check tests in a row, which all came out really good. So they stopped the day we came home from Madison, and we were supposed to have visible ID on all the animals at that point in time. Well, you don't truck cows with neck chains on. And we didn't have ear tags in the cows back then either. It was all, their ID was neck chains. So long story short, these cows came off the truck and went into their pens, and they came in and said, these cows aren't ID'd. We're going to expunge your records. We're going to make your test unofficial. I called Jerry, I said, he said, well, what's going to happen? I said, we've got a hearing tomorrow. He said, tomorrow? That doesn't give us much time. I said, no, it doesn't. So I went to the hearing, and I'm sitting down. They're just getting ready to get started. And this gentleman comes walking in with an Armani suit on. I know it was an Armani suit because he told me afterwards. I asked him, but sat down next to me. Are you Bob? I said, yeah, I'm Bob. He says, I'm so-and-so, Mr. Rappaport's attorney. I'm here to help you out. By the time he got done, I think we could have owned Vermont DHI and the farms of every farmer that was on the board of directors. Like he was talking that way. But that's the kind of commitment that Jerry had. He wasn't going to let me flounder on my own, which I definitely would have. He sent the best in Boston up for Vermont DHIA hearing.
That is the commitment he had, and that's why you guys were such a great team at Lylehaven, had all your championships. We could talk about the cows. That might be a podcast, Bob, where we talk about all the cows. This isn't in our plan, but if you had to pick one cow that you worked with at Lylehaven and East Montpelier, who was your favorite cow? I think I know, but I'm curious how we go with that.
I'm going to say Della, the mean old. She tried to kill me one night, but she was the first show cow that I bought at Lylehaven. We ran a lot of miles together.
You pushed the greatest show cow ever, Charity. You pushed her to the brink of getting around her, which nobody ever did, but you pushed her with Della. You would have pushed her as far as anybody, wouldn't you say?
We tried really hard. The day we were out in the middle of the ring at Expo, and Dr. Fred Foreman was judging, and the 2 cows were side by side, and he walked up and he said, he says, let's start with the white cow. And I started to lead out, and I said, which one? And Pete looked at me, and Pete gave a little, like Pete would. And I knew I wasn't going to beat her, but it was fun playing around a little anyway.
Well, the past 2 weeks, we've talked about the greatest rivalry of show cows maybe ever with Footloose and Shakira. But I would say Della and Charity had their battles. I've compared the Footloose Shakira battle with you and Heffering and Della and Charity many times. Never got around her, but pushed her to the end. Bob, you've referenced a lot of our New England people. We're both Vermonters. We both went to UVM. What a wealth of people you and I were blessed with. I think if you and I have had any success in this business, it's because of who we grew up around. My gosh, we grew up around some good people. And you mentioned a few of them earlier. I don't want to get into them, but think about Hugh Langmaid, Vermont Pondview. You've probably got stories you could and couldn't tell about Hugh.
A lot I couldn't, but I did think of one, and it relates to me being a classifier. We were at the Vermont State Show the first time that I had been there, or I had been there many times, but with Lylehaven was the first time I had been there, and we had a big day. Della was grand. We had another cow, Joseph Mastro Venus. She was reserved. We won a lot of classes. Hugh come up to me after and he said, you know, you weren't a bad classifier. I wish you were still doing it. And he turned around and walked away. That was one of the best compliments I ever got. You know?
Yeah, and Hugh didn't give compliments. He really
No,
meant
that's as close as you'd get.
Yeah, he never gave compliments. But those guys, and think about what Gary Darling did in his career. He was ahead of his time, really, Bob. You know, working with great cows. You know, and my neighbor Ed Gould, who was my mentor, he, you know, if I had to pick one person that allowed me the chance to work with great cows, you know, Ed Gould did that when I was a kid because I grew up 5 miles from him, and he was really good to me. You know, all those guys, you know, are gone now, and many of them, you know, Ed Gould, Gary Darling, gone too soon for sure. But
absolutely.
While we're on the topic of icons and heroes and mentors, when I grew up showing cows in Vermont, the highlight of my life was always going to the University of Vermont to compete at the big shows there. And the arena we showed in was the Fitzsimmons Arena. And I think sometimes, Bob, people don't know a lot about your dad, but he, you know, for our listeners, Bob's dad, Robert Fitzsimmons, was an iconic man in extension here in Vermont and at the University of Vermont. The big arena at the University of Vermont that we showed cows in for years and years is the Robert Fitzsimmons Arena. I want to talk about mentors of yours. Lead off with a little piece about your dad.
Well, I was pretty young when my dad died, but he instilled the love of cows in me. He used to take me to shows when he was judging. He took me to shows when UVM was showing. I, you know, slept in the barns when I was a little guy, along with everybody else. There weren't any campers or hotel rooms back in those days. He loved the business. He loved the people in the business. If he had a fault, he worked too hard. He was in the Army Reserves, and his 2 weeks vacation a year was he went away to Army Reserve camp. When he passed away, a good friend of his that was in World War II with him told me a story. And he would never talk about his time in Europe in World War II. You could ask him any question you want. He'd just change the subject and move on to something else. But his friend Bill Corey told me, he said, we were in trenches in a foxhole for 2 days being shelled in France. And he said, we basically couldn't move. We just had to stay there with our helmets on and wait for somebody to tell us to do something different. And he said there was this old Jersey cow about 200 yards out in front that was just bellering straight for 2 days. And obviously she hadn't been milked for a while. He said, I looked over one morning and there was Fitzy. He climbed up out of that ditch and he was crawling across on his hands and knees toward that cow. He got up to her and he milked her out, and then he came back. He said, I thought, you're crazy. He said, he loved cattle. He loved animals, you know, and it just tore him apart that poor old girl was out there and full of milk. And so he decided to do something about it.
Wow.
So that was the hero of World War II, milked that cow out.
But what a great story, and volumes to what he instilled in you about the cow business, because you would be the same.
Not sure.
Well, I've seen you crawl out of ditches for cows before. But
yeah, absolutely.
Well, on the topic of mentors and heroes, you mentioned working for Bill Weeks earlier. I know he's one of your mentors and heroes. Tell us about Bill Weeks.
Probably the most intelligent human being I have ever been around. Like, the guy was just amazing. He could look at cows and tell you things. How do you know that? You know, and he said, well, I've looked at a lot of cows and I've milked a lot of cows, and, you know, on and on. I can remember, and he taught me so much. Like, I think that's part of the reason why I was pretty good as a classifier and a judge. Was I remember sitting in a cafe in New York. We were on our way to United Breeders to analyze the bulls there. And I had never analyzed the bull before, but he always took someone with him. So there was more than one person looking at these bulls, because the numbers he put on them were pretty important. You know, there were a lot of people making decisions based on that. So there was a picture of a doe and a fawn. The doe was drinking water on the wall. And he says, if that doe was a bull, what would be her first number? And I looked at her and said, well, she's got a long neck. She got a really sharp shoulder, really refined bone. I guess her first number, the one thing she could do best is dairy, number one. He said, oh, he says, how much milk you think she gives? Well, probably not a lot. It just feeds that little fawn. That's exactly. He says, you want to try again? As far as dairy character, I'll always remember that after that, that there's a lot more to it than just refinement of the bone and the length of the neck. And you got to have a motor to go along with it. So
that you and I talk about all the time, skinny and dairy are two different terms. And I think you've taught me that. And I think Bill Weeks taught you that. But, and what other, give me a couple other examples of cow things that Bill Weeks instilled in you that are important, or people things.
We used to sit on the show trunk and drink a lot of beer when I was in high school. I know you're not supposed to do that, but we did that at Rutland Fair.
You were old in high school, Bob. So go ahead.
I was. I missed a few grades, so we sat on the trunk at Madison one year, and he sat down and he says, do you have a Miller High Life? I said, I've got one right here for you, Bill. I got it for him. He says, it's a shame that the best young cow on the fairgrounds didn't win today. And I'm trying to think who that would be. I thought the judge did a pretty good job and all that. Finally, he says, yeah, he said that black 2-year-old that you have there. And she ended up being All-American the following year by All-American, All-Canadian. She came in. Unfortunately, she was an astrojet and got astrojet disease, and that was the end of her. But she could have been, the kind of cow that could have got the whole deal done. But, he saw that. I didn't see it. I love the cow, but it was things like that he was looking at a guy's cow one day, and she had been a cow that had been granted a bunch of different places and stuff like that. And he says, yeah, she's a little different. She's got an extra rib. I said, an extra rib? And I went and looked, and I counted them. She did. She had an extra rib, and he just looked at her quick and knew immediately that she had one more rib than any other cow in the world. Nobody, even the guy that owned her, didn't know that. He was pretty amazing.
Oh, those are great stories. I wish more of our listeners knew Bill Weeks, because he was, like you say, they're guys with that kind of talent of your dad about cows. They're few and far between. Just like Babe Ruth or Carl Yastrzemski or whoever, the great ones in any business are the great ones, right? And that leads me to my next person I want to talk about. And for me, probably the guy that mentored me as much as anyone as a kid and taught me as much. And I've got stories about him forever, good and bad. But our dear friend Bob Lord, he meant the world to both of us. Tell our listeners about Bob Lord, because I'm afraid not enough of them remember the cigar smoke and the white hat and Bob Lord stories. Can you tell people about Bob Lord?
How much time you got? The cigar was a big one. I mean, he always had that cigar going, and he showing cows as kids when he was showing Billings jerseys, like at this Essex Fair, the Vermont State Show jerseys and the Holsteins. And I remember one day he's showing jerseys. I was helping him out a little bit, hauling cows back and forth from the barn for him. And I think he won every cow class but the 2-year-old class. The judge, who was young, I can't think of who it was now. I'd like to remember. He may have just disappeared after this happened, but he starts giving his reasons and goes through all the cows. And he said, I'm going to go way out on a limb here today, and I'm going to make this 2-year-old grand champion. That's before they had intermediate champion and all that. And that was the one cow that wasn't a Billings farm cow. And so Bob came out of the ring, handed me his cow. He said, wait right here. He ran into the barn, came back out with a saw in his hand, and yelled like the whole fairgrounds could hear it. I forget what the guy's name, I'm going to say it was Joe. Said, hey, Joe, climb back out there on that limb, would you? He's holding the saw.
Oh, that is vintage Bob Lord, isn't it?
Or when we owned a junior 2-year-old with him, and we're showing her at Louisville, and he's the judge. And he had an associate judge with him, and I'm going around the ring, and I see him talking to the associate judge, and the associate judge had just been burning a hole in my heifer's side with his eyes, just watching her. So Bob says, I've got an interest in one of the animals in this class. He says, so I can't place her, so you're going to have to place her. And the guy says to him loud enough so I could hear, he says, well, I'll tell you what. He says, she's going to have to be one hell of a heifer to beat that dark colored heifer over there. And he says, guess what? that's her. And you're right.
And she won.
And she did.
But what a magnificent cow, man. Think about what he did over the years at Billings. National champions,
Yeah.
some of the
Unbelievable.
great cows. I've never met a better cowman than Bob Lord. And talk about ability to get a cow ready. I mean, we can't tell those stories, but think about what he did, Fitzy, with cows.
I'd never seen the stuff that he did until, we were in the barns with him I think it was in Rutland Fair, and just watched the transformation of this young cow, and said, oh, it isn't all about just washing them and clipping them and giving them a little bit of fill before they go in the ring. More to it than that. And a tremendous showman, like not a flashy showman, but like getting the job done. I remember we're at Eastern States. We had a cow by the name of Christmas Carol, and she had an amazing udder and as good a rear udder as you ever seen on a young cow. She's out there in the ring with a cow by the name of Tierback Elevation Twink. And Bob shoved that Twink cow around the ring, like shadowed her out where the judge, I don't know if he ever got a chance to look at her. And every time the judge got within eyesight of Bob, he'd swing old Christmas Carol's butt around so that rear udder is just looking right in the guy's face. Christmas Carol won. Twink was second. Twink won and was grand at Harrisburg, won and was grand at World Dairy Expo, won and was grand at the Western National, won and was grand at the Royal Winter Fair. Difference being Bob Lord didn't show Christmas Carol. Christmas Carol, who knows, might have done that too.
She could have all that fame, but boy, he was crafty, and he got a rush out of doing things like that.
He did.
He was
the old cigar was just going boo, 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 boo.
Yeah, so cantankerous and smart, and loved competition. Loved competition.
Yeah.
You're talking about what a great showman. Tell our listeners quick. I still love the story about the day Kate, your little girl, beat him at the show. You want to tell that story real quick?
Sure. Kate was 5. I bought her a calf in Norm Nabholz's sale. Really good calf and a big bugger. And so we're at the Vermont State Jersey show, and first show Kate had ever been first show she ever led at. So I tell her, I said, Mr. Lord? And she says, yeah, he's the guy with the cigar. I said, yeah, that's the right guy. I said, you go in the ring right behind him and you follow right behind him until the judge tells you to do something different. Okay. So Bob goes into the ring with a pretty little calf. I mean, a really pretty calf. Kate goes in right behind him. Got a calf that's, this much bigger, this much longer. And he looked back and he saw her, and he went out of the side of the ring and twirled around and came back in. And I could see him kind of chuckling away. The only thing, he didn't look behind him because Kate had followed him right around and come right in behind him, like she did what I told her to do. So she won. He was second, and Dot, Bob's wife, was there, and he sits down next to her after the class was over, and Dot says, and Kate's sitting there on the bench sucking her thumb, and Dot says to Bob, when was the last time you were outsmarted by a thumbsucker?
Oh, those are great memories. And, we could go on forever. Your dad, Bob Fitzsimmons, Bill Weeks, Bob Lord, we've talked about Hugh Langmaid and Gary Darling and Ed Gould. My gosh, those are iconic people. So thanks for those stories. We may have to do this again, Bob, because people are going to want to know more about it. You and I have been on some amazing cow hunting trips, some good, some bad. We've been on a lot of wild goose chases, haven't we? And one of my favorite lines about Fitzy is he'll say, we're going cow hunting today, and it'll probably be a wild goose chase, and we'll probably have wild goose shit on our windshield when we're done. But we ended up with our fair share of wild goose shit on our windshield. Not necessarily with me, but do you have a favorite cow hunting trip that you love to talk about?
I've had a lot of wild goose chases over the years. One of the ones that kind of sticks in my, actually is not a wild goose chase, it sticks in my head most. And Ken Empey, who helped us find a lot of the really, really great cows that were at Lylehaven, calls me one day and he said, I saw a really good 2-year-old. I got a price from the guy. We're all set. Here's what the price is. Are you interested? I said, absolutely. I'll be there on Thursday. I fly to Toronto. Ken picks me up at the airport. We go to look at this cow. We walk in the barn and the cow just blows me away. The guy comes walking in the barn. Ken says, "Hi, Jim. How you doing? What's going on today?" He says, "Oh, things are going good." And he says, "I've been thinking, Ken, talking to the wife and kids, we really don't want to sell the cow. We're going to show her ourselves." So Ken cranks his arm for probably about an hour and decides this ain't going to work. So we get back in the car. I think it was a Lincoln. Ken liked driving Lincolns. I asked him one time, I said, "You go out buying cows in this thing, don't you think people are going to jack the price a little?" He says, "You drive one of these, people know you're going to pay for her." I said, "Okay, gotcha."
Good advice.
Anyway, we get back in the car and Ken just starts banging his head against the steering wheel, like hard. Like I'm thinking, boy, you're going to hurt yourself there. He says, "You find a cow. You look and look and look and look and look, and you find a cow. You get the price for the cow. It's not too bad. It's high, but it's not too bad. You call the guy wants the cow. The guy says, 'Yeah, I want the cow.' The guy flies up, you pick him up, you go to the farm, and the guy don't want to sell the cow." And so we drive away. I call Jerry. Jerry is going to fly to Toronto with a suitcase full of money to buy this cow. Like, we're all stirred up at this point in time. About 3, 4, 5 days later, Ken calls. He says, "I talked to the guy again." He said, you can have the cow for that price. So we buy the cow. Everything is good. About 2 weeks later, I get a call from a guy, Western Pennsylvania, knows cows really well. Says, "There's a really good 2-year-old down here. You better come look at her." So I go to look at this cow. I walk in the barn. The guy says, "I know why you're here, but she's not ready to be seen yet. She's not fresh that long, and I'm not letting anybody look at her until she's ready to be seen." I said, "Geez, I just drove 9 hours to see this cow. Can I please just take a quick look at her?" And finally, I talk him into it. So I walk down through the barn. There she's standing in the box. Oh, boy. So here I just paid a lot of money for a 2-year-old. And there's one I like better. So I try and buy her. Couldn't get her bought. No way he was selling her. Anyway, long story short, they were first and second at Madison.
Wow.
And our cow won. I like the other cow better, but our cow won, so I was happy about that. And Jerry was happy about that too. So.
And he didn't have to go with his suitcase full of money.
No, he didn't go up there with suitcase. I think he wanted to, though, Tim. I think that was like one of his fantasies in life, that he was going to walk into a barn with a suitcase full of money and buy a great cow. So.
Well, I wish he was still around. I'd help him with his fantasy.
I wish he was still around too, for different reasons, but
yeah, no, great stories. So Bob, as we wrap this up, this is a loaded question, but in the cow business, what would you say? Do you have a memory that you think is your favorite memory? Like, is there something that, as they write the story of Bob Fitzsimmons, what story goes with you in the industry?
Probably the highest that I have ever been, other than family stuff, was when we had grand champion at Madison with Bugs Black Star Buffy. We were at the national convention in Texas. Pat was with me. Somebody told me about this good cow. So we jumped in the car and drove. I don't know how far we did. We drove and drove and drove and drove, and finally got to where she was. And Pat will tell a different story than I do. She loves this part of the deal. It's probably the only time she was with me when I bought a cow, and she ended up being grand at Madison. But she said, "Not the white cow, Bob, not the white cow, the black cow over here, the black cow." But that's not the way it went. So we bought the cow. She was stale, due in September. Perry got her calved in right on, and I walked out of the barn at Madison. I'd been there so many times thinking I had a chance of being grand. In the Holstein show, I've had grand the Jersey show and grand the red and white show a couple times, but this is the first time I had grand in the Holstein show. And I think the cow had problems after she had mastitis. We sent her to an ET station. She got off the truck in the middle of the night. Another cow knocked her down and broke her leg. Ended up having to euthanize her. Like, she had a real short career. But if you really analyze this cow, she was near perfect. Like, there wasn't a hole in the cow. She wasn't a monster. She was like 62 inches tall, but she was She was a real cow. And that day, that was as close to euphoria in the business as I guess I'll ever get.
Luckily, I've had the same experience, and in the cow business, there's nothing like it.
No.
The lows can be low, but things like that are certainly high. You alluded to Pat a couple times. You've had a great career. Tell us a little about your wife. You've been married a few years now. I thought when I got to know you 30 years ago, she'd dump you, but she still seems to be hanging on. Tell us.
She's tough.
She is tough, and that might be the understatement of the day. Pat is a great, great gal who, like any of our wives of people that travel, Bob, they deserve a gold medal for what they did while you and I were on the road traveling.
Pat was a school teacher. I met her right after I graduated, actually, from UVM. She was undergrad at UVM, and, we've been together ever since. And I can't tell you how many years, but it's a lot. It's a lot of them. She has put up a lot. Like I've traveled extensively most of my life and still do some traveling now, but she's always been happy about it. She raised 3 great kids. We always said if we could raise 3 kids that we didn't have to buy insurance for, we've had a successful life. Well, I've got 2 that have masters and 1 that's a doctor. My son is a school teacher at a kind of a bad school in Burlington, and I think he's really valued there. Like my daughter is a physical therapist, and my other daughter is an attorney. And I've got 5 grandkids now. 3 boys and 2 girls, and they're a hoot to be around. They like to go fishing with me. They like to play in the garden with me. It'll be fun to see how they develop throughout their lives.
I'm lucky to say I've gotten to know all your kids and their spouses pretty well over the years, and I've got great stories about T-Man. And Erin and I, one of my favorite things to do, Bob, at the Vermont State Holstein show is it was always Erin's birthday. Remember those days? And Erin would always come to the show, and Erin didn't want any more go to a cow show than anything, but I'd take her out one afternoon and we'd go on the rides, and we'd ride those stupid rides until we both were going to throw up. And Erin and I have been forever connected, haven't we? For our
she loved that fair.
She loved the fair, and she loved to go on those rides. I say that I had a lot to do with forming, Erin's life, because those afternoons riding the Ferris wheel, we got to talk about a lot of things.
I think you did. I think that's why she became a physical therapist. You were always complaining about all these things that were wrong with you. And she says, there's a lot of business for this out there.
Touche. You got that right. I always like to leave young people, old people, any of us, we all need advice every day. And I just did a bunch of interviews at Expo, and I learned so much about mentorship. We all think of mentors as being older people or people that we look up to. Sometimes it's young people, because we got to learn every day. Whether it's to me, Bob, or to some 20-year-old listening to this on his tractor, what advice do you give people about being in this business?
Well, what we've been talking about pretty much the whole time, Tim, is the people that influenced us. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Watch what's going on. Like the people that you admire, watch what they're doing. I remember, here's another quick Ken Eppy story. He helped us the first year we were at the Vermont State Show. And he says, you want to kind of learn some of this stuff? I said, yeah, I would like to, Ken. He said, you go down there, those guys, watch how they're feeding their cows. So I went down, I watched and came back, and he said, do you watch them really close? I said, yeah, I did. He said, don't ever do anything that they just did. Ask questions, tap into the resources that are around you. We've talked about how lucky we were to have the people that we could do that with. We could pick their brains. We could talk to them. We could watch what they're doing. And if you have a chance to get a job or an internship or with someone that you really admire, I think that's a great thing to do. I know there's a lot of the better show herds around that are doing internships with young people. Tack on with a crew that's successful. Watch what they do and emulate what they do.
Great advice, and I think our listeners will appreciate that. Just quickly, and we will wrap this up. Bob, what are you doing with your time now? Our listeners probably curious. What we don't see at the shows much anymore. What are you doing to keep busy?
I do some semen sales for Blondin and Jetstream, and actually in southern New England, almost anybody because there isn't much for reps down there. I like playing around my garden, mowing the lawn, tilling gardens, playing with my grandkids when I can. One of the nice things about my semen selling business is I can spend nights with Aaron and with Kate when I'm out on the road. I don't have to stay in a hotel, and I get to have meals with my kids and my grandkids, and that's a great thing. I like to hunt and fish, and I like taking friends and family and any of the grandkids that want to do that. We do a lot of fishing. We keep the boat at Cape Cod in the summertime, and that's a lot of fun. We go down there for a couple weeks every summer, and just I'm lucky to have the whole family there. Like everybody that I talked to about it says, your whole family goes? I said, yeah, even my sister and her kids go. It's a great life. For a couple 6 or 7 months, I didn't do anything after I retired from ABS other than kind of hang around here. What you alluded to earlier in the conversation, Tim, one day Pat says to me, find something to do and get out of here for a while, please. So that's when I started doing the semen thing a little bit. And I really like doing that. I like talking to farmers, and I don't have the knowledge of the business that I used to have. So, I probably can't be as spot on as far as giving people bull advice, but maybe that's a good thing.
A lot of info out there.
Yeah.
Well, Bob, I thank you from the bottom of my heart for doing this episode of the evolution of the great cow. We really haven't talked a lot about cows today, but we've talked a lot about people and mentors and leadership and great stories that I'm glad we chronicle in this series. Bob, I'm going to embarrass you a little bit, but for my career, certainly I grew up with my dad, who was a cattle dealer that I learned a lot from, but nobody in this business has taught Tim Abbott more than Bob Fitzsimmons. And you're the greatest cowman of your generation. For me to sit here and call you one of my best friends and have this interview with you and do this, it's been magical. So Fitzy, on behalf of our listeners, thank you for joining us. Any parting thoughts?
Greatest cowman you're the greatest cowman in the business right now.
No, I've listened and tried to emulate, and gosh, it's been fun, Fitzy. So
it has been fun. It was great when we're working together, and we've had a lot of laughs together. I appreciate you asking me, Tim. I couldn't quite figure out why you did, but I'm glad that you did. And thank you so much. And you're on top of the game right now. You're the kingpin, the top dog. So congratulations.
Yeah, the good part of having some success is somebody's going to knock you off. So
you're all out there to try and do that. That's for sure.
Well, we thank you for listening to this episode of the Evolution of the Great Cow, sponsored by Showbox Sires. We like to talk through these interviews like we're sitting on a showbox, like Mike Duckett and I wanted to do when we developed this new company. That's the way we want to select our bulls. That's the way we want to drive our business. And we're pretty fortunate to be able to do these podcast series with legends of the business. We thank you for listening and look forward to you joining us on our next episode of the Evolution of the Great Cow on the Dairy Voice with Dairy Business.